Howdy, y'all. Okay, some brief context real quick for the uninitiated. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Godzilla series got real lazy and started reusing a lot of footage from previous entries. I want to analyze all of the reused stuff to see how they made it fit into their movie. And let's start off with the first movie that reused footage, the second movie in the series, Godzilla Raids Again. Okay, so I know this one isn't really what people talk about, and I know I literally just said late 60s, early 70s films, but this one counts too. While this one doesn't reuse footage in any of the monster fighting scenes, there is a section in this movie where all of the characters just sit down and watch scenes from the original movie for a minute and a half. I'm not joking. But I kind of gone over all of that and why that's bad in my actual video on Raids Again, so let's just see how they use the original footage here. Okay, they play the projector for a bit, watching the section where Godzilla takes down all of the towers, nice and dandy. But then look at what they do here. He's taking down the last of the towers, they cut back to the group watching, and then boom, it cuts back to earlier in the first movie when Godzilla is just stomping down on the trains. I have no idea why they decided to play these scenes in non-chronological order. Like, in the original movie, after he takes down the towers, he goes on to attack Tokyo, so I don't know why they didn't just play that for this section. But then again, maybe these two were just the director's favorite scenes from the first movie, so he just wanted to play it and just did not care if it made no sense. Well, I guess it makes sense in this movie. It's not like they're actually sitting down to watch the first movie here. They're just essentially watching found footage from the first attack on Tokyo. So I guess it can be in non-chronological order and still makes sense, but that's all besides the point. And yeah, overall this scene is just some pretty blatant padding. But again, went over all that in my Raids Again video, so let's just move on to the next movie. Destroy All Monsters. Yeah, again, this is one of those movies that does not come to mind when you think of Godzilla movies reusing footage, but there is a small scene in this movie that takes footage from Ghidorah the three-headed monster, and it is this small part right here. Yeah, they literally only took the footage of Ghidorah reforming, or I guess just forming for the first time. And you know what? I don't want to hold this against Destroy All Monsters in the slightest. I really don't. I imagine that the cell animation for the forming scene would have taken some time and been a little costly. So if they just wanted to swipe that footage and use it here, I can't really blame them, because it lasts all of 10 seconds, and Lord knows this movie had its work cut out for it, so I can't even begin to blame it for using this footage here. I mean, again, reusing any footage is lazy no matter how you look at it, but this is easily the least egregious example of it on this list, so I'm gonna cut it some slack. And this shot lasts for such a short period of time, I really don't think you would pick up on it unless you were just watching all of these movies back to back. Like me. Speaking of back to back movies, let's go over the next film in the series, All Monsters Attack. Okay, so we went from two movies that you may not think of when you think of reusing footage, and then we just jump right into the deep end with the movie you're absolutely gonna start thinking about when you think of Godzilla movies reusing footage. Look, I already made an entire 20-minute video on this movie, so I really don't want to give it any more time than it deserves. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it for at least a few minutes in a video that's going over reused footage in Godzilla movies. Not talking about it here would be like not talking about the Beatles when you bring up British bands. I am very much so obliged to bring it back up. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it, so I'll just go over one scene in this film. Well, technically two scenes, but let me explain. To give some brief context, in Ebra, Horror of the Deep, you have this scene where Godzilla takes down a big bird so it doesn't hurt a lady friend of his. I will not explain further. He goes on to kill the bird, but then some of the planes, piloted by the antagonist of the film, fly over to attack, only for Godzilla to take them down as well. And that's that for that movie scene. Over back in All Monsters Attack, though, in the scene where Ichiro first goes to the island, he sees the big bird fly over to Godzilla, and then they play out the section of him attacking and killing the bird. And at this point, you kind of expected to just go ahead and play out the rest of the footage with him attacking the planes, but no, they actually do cut away. This movie showed some restraint in reusing footage. You have to give it a little credit. And nope, you don't have to give it credit at all, actually. Because much later in the film, with Ichiro and Manila watching, Godzilla then goes on to take down the planes as well. This movie divided up this scene so that it could stitch one part earlier in the film and the other part much later. It's almost like it was embarrassed to play the scene out in full. Both sections of this scene are trimmed down a bit, a few shots missing here and there, and obviously the people's reaction shots in Ebra were cut out altogether. Although oddly enough, at the start of the scene, where the planes attack Godzilla, they have this small canopy of trees superimposed on the footage, which I guess is to make it match more into the jungle setting that Ichiro and Manila are in. But it's so weird because throughout the rest of the scene, it's pretty obvious that that's not the environment that Godzilla is in. And they literally only superimposed the trees in this one shot. In other shots where they could have done it as well, they just straight up didn't. I would say I'm surprised that this movie didn't bother to put the trees on in other shots where they could have, but when it comes to All Monsters Attack, I cannot be surprised by its laziness anymore. So I wasn't gonna bring it up, but talking about the superimposed trees reminded me of another infamous example of superimposed imagery on the reused footage in this film, but I actually already talked about in my main video on All Monsters Attack. Please give that a watch. So forgive me if I just reuse that clip here, yeah, just to be in the spirit of the video and everything. But somehow, even worse than that, they reused one of the scenes from Son of Godzilla where Manila was trapped before the spider monster. Obviously that wouldn't work here because he's supposed to be watching from the sidelines. So what do? They just slap on a superimposed rock to cover him up. The lot of good it does though, because they still left in this part where he's clearly visible on the ground. It doesn't last long, but it's still there. Natural segue back into this video now. Okay, so that's all that I ever want to talk about All Monsters Attack. Let's move on to the next movie in the list, which is actually the movie that inspired me to make this video in the first place, Godzilla vs. Gigan. When I was editing my review of Godzilla vs. Gigan, I noticed some funny things about how they had to edit their reused footage for the film. I was tempted to bring it up in that video, but at that point I was already far into the editing process. But then I realized I could spin that off into its own separate video maybe, so here we are now! Okay, so the first main thing to talk about this film and its reuse of footage is that all of the new scenes shot for this film were shot to make them look like they took place at night, while all of the reused footage was shot during the daytime, or rather shot on sound stages to make it look like night or day, but that's besides the point. So this movie had to noticeably dim all of the footage to try to make it match up, but again, it doesn't work because you can still see all of the blue skies. I don't care how hard you try to tint it, the blue sky is still blue. But again, I went over all of that in my review of Godzilla vs. Gigan, so please give that a watch after you're done watching this video, hopefully. So let's move on from that and go over to this scene where Godzilla is pushed into a red bridge by Ghidorah. Okay, so I literally just noticed this in editing. In this original scene from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Mothra in her larvae form is present, right, at Godzilla's knees. You can see her right there. And in the Gigan footage, they left her there, even though she's not supposed to be in this movie. I'm not going to hold this against this film because this is literally just something I noticed in the editing process. But it is a little embarrassing for me because later in the video, when I'm going over the next movie, I kind of make a big stink about this exact thing. So take this entire video with a grain of salt, y'all. Now, this scene itself isn't all that notable. There's a small section where they edit out for some reason to make it go by quicker, but that's all fine and dandy. What I find funny here is that much earlier in this film, where Gingo first goes over to meet Mr. Kubota, you actually see a model of this same red bridge built right beside the park. Which I just find this so funny because it means they planned out which footage they were going to reuse here. They planned out their laziness. That I have to respect that. It's funny, I guess it also adds continuity between the old scenes and the new scenes, but aside from that, the other section I want to talk about here is later where Ghidorah and Anguirus are fighting. Now, for context, this scene here was originally from Destroy All Monsters, where all of the monsters are just ganging up on Ghidorah, with Anguirus biting down on Ghidorah's neck. And Ghidorah flies off, and Anguirus is still attached to him for a bit through the neck biting, until he eventually falls back down to the ground. And that's when Ghidorah decides to fly on over and stomp on Anguirus for a little bit to show him what's what. In the process, somehow not stabbing his feet with all of Anguirus' spines, but that's besides the point. That's how it plays out originally. Now let's see how it plays out in Godzilla vs. Gigan. It starts out with some new footage of Anguirus sneaking up behind Ghidorah. After a little bit, Anguirus bites down on Ghidorah's tail. Ghidorah reacts to this by knocking him aside, having him land in the old footage from Destroy All Monsters, which, first off, I find that really funny by itself. Ghidorah literally tossed Anguirus into a different movie. And where Anguirus falls down here is where he gets back up in the old footage, so that's how they transition from the new to old here. And then it goes on to show the scene of Ghidorah stomping on Anguirus' back for a second, but then, oh, look at what happens here. Then Anguirus is biting down on Ghidorah's tail, and then he's suddenly biting on Ghidorah's neck, and then it shows the section of, like, Ghidorah flying with Anguirus attached to him for a bit, which is like, hold on. They played this scene directly in the opposite order. Now, to be fair, I understand why they had to do this. Remember, in Destroy All Monsters, like, essentially every monster in Toho canon was present for this fight, give or take a few kaiju. So, like, they had to really edit around the old footage here so that only Anguirus and Ghidorah were present. And to be fair, I actually think they did a pretty decent job of making sure no other kaiju were shown. Because we'll get into the next movie and how they utterly failed to do that, but like, that we'll get there when we get there. But because of the way they had to edit the old footage, the way it plays out makes no sense. Like, Anguirus goes from being underneath Ghidorah, being stomped on, to suddenly biting down on Ghidorah's neck with no rhyme or reason. I'm not editing this footage at all. There's just legitimately no continuity between shots here. Like, if you were watching this without the knowledge that this was all just, like, heavily edited, reused footage, you'd probably be, like, really confused what's supposed to be happening here. I mean, again, I'm impressed that they were able to make this footage work in this scene, but, like, I would have been more impressed if you just shot your own stuff. Another small thing I want to mention real quick is that this movie reuses some small scenes of the military moving across the land. I'll admit, these are a lot harder to, like, spot and for me to, like, recognize which movie these are from, so I did not bother tracing back in other films to try to find out where these came from exactly. Also, I think these shots are pretty interchangeable either way, so I don't blame this movie as much for using them. Again, they should have shot their own stuff, but I'd rather they reuse scenes like this that are interchangeable, but, like, they use these scenes on top of all the monster stuff. All of this is just like the cherry on top of the recycled footage sundae. Okay, so another thing real quick that I just noticed in editing. In this scene where Godzilla is first brought before the Godzilla Tower, you have this one shot where he's shot in the eye first, you have this one part where he's shot in the eye from one of the lasers. Great. And then, literally not 1 minute later, Godzilla stands back up, and they replay the shot of him getting shot in the eye. They replay the same exact shot, only for him to fall back down to the ground, and you so easily could not have reused that shot here. Just don't have him stand back up. It's like you actively wrote in for him to stand up just so you could use this shot twice. What is with this movie and reusing shots? Okay, I'm a little afraid this entire video is going to be a mess. Let's wrap all of this up by going over the last offending film, Godzilla vs. Megalon. Okay, before I really dive into all the reused footage with this film, I just kind of want to gush over Godzilla's design here. We all know that Godzilla became like a lot more kid-friendly in the later 60s, early 70s, and they tried to make his design look more kid-friendly, failing spectacularly with a few of them. This movie, though, is the first to roll out this design of the Big G, and I think this is the perfect mixture of him still looking threatening enough to still be scary to other monsters, while still having round enough features to, like, be child-friendly. Like, I'm not joking, this is legitimately one of my favorite designs of Godzilla out there. I wish I could find a decently priced figurine of it or Oh, yeah, as soon as Godzilla appears in this movie, they reuse another scene from Ebra Horror of the Deep where he jumps off the island. Between this and All Monsters Attack, I have no doubt Ebra was the movie that had the most footage taken from it. Other than that, though, this film also reuses shots of the military moving across the ground, funnily enough, reusing some of the shots that the previous movie already reused. It honestly makes me wonder if this film nabbed them from the original movie, or if they just nabbed them from Godzilla vs. Gigan. Wait, actually, I don't have to wonder that. Because later in this movie, we have a scene of Megalon flying over the city causing havoc, and all of the destruction footage here is reused from Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster again. All of the same scenes that Godzilla vs. Gigan already reused. But here's the thing, they didn't take this footage from Ghidorah, they took it from the previous film. And how do I know this? Because they also reused some of the shots that Gigan was in. Yeah, there he is right there, breaking down a bridge. I can't believe their laziness. This movie just brought a whole nother level of laziness to the table. Like, at least with the previous two in this video, they tried to edit around all of the monsters that weren't in the film. Godzilla vs. Gigan edited all around the footage of Anguirus and Ghidorah fighting so that none of the other monsters were present. And as bad as the superimposed rock was, at least they made an attempt to hide Manila. Here though, this movie just straight up shows Gigan. Like, I'm almost impressed at how much they obviously didn't care here. It's not like it would have been all that hard to edit around him either. If you had just stuck with all of the footage from Ghidorah, he wouldn't have been there. Lord, I just realized this movie is recycling footage from a scene that already had recycled footage in it. And yes, going back to this scene, Gigan is in this movie, but he's not supposed to be here. Heck, he doesn't even make his first appearance in this film until much oh my lord! This movie only came out 1 year after the previous installment, and it's already taking so much footage from it. Thankfully, this is where the recycling of old footage stopped. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla would end the Showa era on the high note by, well, first of all, being pretty good films in their own right, and by not reusing any shots whatsoever. All of the monster action in those two films was fresh and new. like tomatoes at a grocery store. And now, to end this horribly unfocused video, let's do a ranking. Okay, I opened up Tier Maker real quick so that we can rank these bad boys. To explain it real quick, at the top of the list is going to be like the best or like least offending example, and the bottom is going to be the absolute worst. Okay, so like let's start it off real quick. Destroy All Monsters. S rank. I just realized you're absolutely going to hear my mouse. Whatever, we'll just kind of roll with it. Again, Destroy All Monsters, it only used like a 10-second clip. And again, that movie was really effects heavy, so they had a lot on their plate, so I don't even want to like... I almost feel even bad just mentioning it in this video along the other four, because it almost doesn't feel deserved. But either way, it's at S rank. It wasn't too bad. And for the A rank, Godzilla raids again. Because I just have to admire the audacity of having a scene where everyone stops what they're doing to rewatch the first film for a bit. Like, I truly haven't seen that in any other sequel. Like, yeah, a few bad sequels will, like, have recaps of the first film that go on for, like, way too long. But none of them just, like, straight up sit down to watch the first film. Like, the audacity, really. I'm rambling. Let's go on to B. And B here is going to be Godzilla vs. Gigan. Why B? Because this film does use the footage to, like, move the story forward. Like, it uses the footage to move the plot. You know what I mean? And it does do its best to edit around the footage so that it works the best for its scene. Like, they actually tried to make sure that no other monsters were present that shouldn't be there. And, you know, with the next one on that list, that actually is saying something. And yeah, with all that said, I imagine you know that C is going to be Godzilla vs. Megalon. And yeah, I have all these as the Japanese poster, but this one as the American poster, because the American poster is like really funny when it doesn't need to be. Why are they on top of the World Trade Center? This movie takes place in Japan. That's besides the point. This movie down in C, because at least along the lines of Godzilla vs. Gigan, this movie reuses like the old scenes to like move the story forward and all that good stuff. But they just showed an utter lack of caring when it came to like editing around the footage to make sure it worked for their scenes. Like, the editor must have watched the scene, saw that Gigan was clearly present, and just did not care enough to make a few more extra cuts. Like, that is so beyond lazy at that point. But sadly, not as lazy as All Monsters Attack. Yeah, you already knew this one's gonna be in D tier. Like, I already mentioned it in my review of this movie, but like, it doesn't use the old scenes to move the story forward through the monster scenes. The plot pauses in its tracks all the time so that the characters can rewatch the old footage. Imagine with all of these movies up here, that the monster fighting scenes are kind of like a good song in a musical. You know what I mean? Like, songs in a musical are meant to drive the plot forward, and a good musical knows how to use its songs well for that to happen. All Monsters Attack, though, is like watching a really bad musical that doesn't know how to incorporate its songs. Like, the story will just pause every time so that someone can start singing. That's what this movie feels like. The story pauses every time just so that kaiju can start fighting. And because of that, this movie drags in a way that no other Godzilla movie really does. That, on top of the fact that it easily reuses the most footage. Again, in my video, I think I mentioned that this review of this movie, I mentioned how because of all the footage it reuses, 13% of this movie isn't even this movie. But again, I'm rambling now. Again, it's kind of funny to say because this whole entire video has been a ramble. In case you haven't been able to tell, I tried to do an unscripted video for once to get something out quicker, and I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. It's actually so funny, like, the first night I sat down with the intent of, like, doing the voiceover, I started taking some notes on all of the movies I was doing, and I kind of accidentally just scripted out the video all in pen and paper and pencil. So yeah, that was a good use of my time, because I went on to just ad-lib this thing mostly anyway. This video is going to be a mess. I'm so afraid this video is going to be horribly unfocused. But yeah, again, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I must have done something right, apparently. And until next time, goodbye, y'all.